Yeah. Start from the beginning, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you first hear about work? When were you first kind of aware that one day you were going to have to work? And when did someone first ask you, what do you want to do when you grow up, and all that? How did that all begin?
Oh, well, work has always been very central because you can't have a Calvinist Protestant family which doesn't have a very strong work ethic.
Can I just remembered I'm going to put this on audio on here, just in case.
Yeah, no, do.
Okay, rolling again. So it began because your family has a religious element to it, it was religious for your family.
I think if you are from a Protestant, Calvinist type of upbringing, the idea of work is really, really central to your whole purpose of why you're on earth. So the idea is you work hard on earth, but the riches on earth are kind of only one part of the story, and actually it's about having riches in heaven. And so you're in this crazy situation where you're both told that you need to work very hard because there is something inherently good about that, but also you don't want to work so hard that it's for material gain. It is for a higher purpose, such that when you come, as Christians believe, to the second coming, or you come to die, you have this idea that part of being taken into heaven is a recognition of how much you have denied material things on earth for greater riches in heaven. So there's this crazy situation where, certainly in my upbringing, my dad worked incredibly hard, but also incredibly hard to give us stability rather than luxury.
Right. That's a great answer. I have a few questions.
Yeah.
So, first of all, that's exactly... You've kind of unearthed the whole unconscious of this whole project I'm doing, which is that, to me, even I come from a secular family, I've always had a secular education, but there's always been something I can only describe as religious about the discussion about work, and I've always felt a bit embarrassed to say that to someone because I feel like people will defend it, and people will take issue with that if I say it. So you totally get all that. I'm interested in how aware you were at a young age, though, what you thought then about that, because that was a remarkably kind of removed and observant response.
So, I mean, one thing I should say, this issue about work and what we spend the majority of our lives doing interests me a lot. It's worth me saying that the work that I now do revolves around employment law, the labour market, and how we can make work better. And I think that I have ultimately come to that because work has always been so central to my life. This question about how early did I observe it as something that was morally virtuous, because that's essentially what it was. The reason that you're calling it religious is, another way that I would put it is morally virtuous to work, and to work very hard.
Yeah.
And that was so central so early on, to the extent that it used to dictate my life, and it still does dictate my life, even though I am now not myself religious. It dictates my life insofar as a central phrase that my dad always said to me, and lives by himself, is do what you have to do before you do what you want to do. The implication being you could only enjoy what you wanted to do, be that watching the telly, be that going out with friends, be that even just relaxing.
Yeah.
And I'll come back to that because it actually causes quite a lot of problems in adult life. But doing what you want to do could only be done after you'd done what you had to do, and that was work. So the work aspect became so central to my life from such an early age that it was actually it was almost like the primary driver of my life. So going to school was striving for a higher purpose, meaning education is in itself good, bettering yourself is in itself good, but also whatever stage of life you're at, life can be hard and you've got to work hard at life. So, for example, the first thing that would always be discussed was, have you done your homework? If you've not done your homework, why haven't you done your homework? Because in order to go and do what you want to do or have pudding, I mean, really, you needed to have done your homework. So there was some sort of centrality to it really, really early on. And I think it was also crystallised by the fact that, I mean, I respect my dad a lot because he managed to have a professional job. It's actually funny, we're doing this interview here. His work is a stone's throw from, he works on the South Bank, so it's a stone's throw. And he has always managed to hold down a professional, very middle class, very professional, high stressed corporate job, whilst I feel giving me as much time as possible. Meaning he used to come home, read me a story, put me to bed. He would always work. He'd always fire up his laptop afterwards. He'd always log back on, because I could hear, you know, if you're a baby of the 90s, you know that dial-up tone to get onto the internet. And I used to go to bed after he'd read me a story, but I used to hear downstairs the dial-up tone, meaning Daddy's gone back to work. And that idea that he was never switched off until the day had been done kind of pervaded my attitude towards work as well. Meaning that to me, still, something that I have had to learn, and I'm still learning, is how to put that balance back into my life.
Did you feel ever that the kind of quality time that you spent with you as a family was an extension of the work? Did I pick that up?
I'm laughing because every family moment that went the most smoothly would always be planned. It would always have order to it, be that what time we needed to leave, be that what things we were going to do, be that just everything. I actually think, I mean, he in himself, I don't think I've definitely developed these techniques, but I think he has sort of, I'm very similar to him, much more similar to him in temperament than I think my mum. And he has lists, he has orders, he has that coping strategy to quell anxiety and stress. And I think he would never label it like that, but he has been working to such a high degree of intensity for so long in his life that I think to maintain balance in the rest of his life, he found that doing lists and orders made him able to do that. And what that meant in terms of quality time was that I don't think he saw it as an extension of his work, and I think I'm so proud of him that he was very, very present actually in a lot of our holidays and our family time, but we just all knew that he needed to be planned in order to do that. So it wasn't that family life was an extension of work, it was that unless he had time to process his family time like he would work, i.e. prep it, time manage it, have almost like a goal-oriented idea about what we should achieve in our family time, he wasn't then able to enjoy it.
Right. And I didn't mean for a second to suggest that even if it were an extension of his work, it wouldn't be joyful or pleasurable or freeing in some way, right? And I guess that brings me to the next question, which is, I guess there's some kind of tension between the idea that work can be a joy and the kind of Protestant root of the idea that you're toiling here on earth so that you can enjoy your time in heaven. I guess I've actually just come up with a theory, but I'll put the question to you before I say anything else.
So I never thought that work could be a joy. at its heart, and I still don't think it can.
Okay.
And that's something which in adulthood is, I know, not to be true. Obviously your work can be a joy, but just personally, from my personal experience, I think I would find it very, very, very difficult to say I think I would find it very difficult to say I could jack in my 9 to 6 office job for something that was more joyous to me. Partly actually because I don't know what. I don't have a skill or a passion that I think could be commercialised. You know, some people are into photography, some people can sing excellently, some people can make condiments amazingly, you know, whatever it is. And they can turn that into an enterprise. I don't think I've got those skills, but I also feel like it would cause me cognitive dissonance. How do you say that? Cognitive dissonance, to be able to say, actually, I'm going to make money from something that in and of itself gives me pleasure. There is something which makes me feel like at the end of a hard day's work, the reason that I can enjoy my time is because somehow I've gone through toil during the day. And I know that that is insane, and it causes lots of problems with stress, particularly in home actually, because you know, my boyfriend does not have that view at all. He is seeking to pursue a career in something that ultimately he loves,
finds joy from, yeah.
And he finds joy from. And I must admit that it causes tension, because sometimes, you know, he works incredibly hard, and I have been in that academic environment enough myself to know that stuff around getting funding, speaking at conferences, the actual almost architectural process of putting together a paper is hard work. But don't get me wrong, when he has spent a day reading and thinking compared to a day having to, you know, convince a boss to do something, having to avert a crisis, having to answer a tough question on why you've not delivered, I fundamentally think you should cook the dinner today because I've had a harder day's work.
Okay. I had a question come up whilst you were saying that. Yeah, so a question that I struggle with then is, because I'm somewhere in between the two of you guys, you know? I feel I don't necessarily know that I have to feel some toil that I've had to struggle, you know. Well, or maybe I do, but it's not quantified in pain, you know. It's or even the absence of pleasure. It's that there's a cycle I have to go through. I have to go through certain stages every day, and if I remain at stage 1 all day, I just feel crap about myself in the evening, you know. Whereas if I've gone through a process of some kind.
Yeah. So I think the word to use, because I should say, in all of this, all of what I've said up till now, these are my preconceived ideas of work. I definitely don't think that the idea that you need to have toiled to have done a good day's work, I don't think it's healthy. I don't think it's something that you should seek to have achieved. Is that all right?
It's flashing at me. I'm not sure why. It's possible the video will cut out, in which case we continue with the audio.
That's good. Okay, so I think it's worth saying, I don't think that concept of you haven't worked hard if you haven't toiled is a good thing. I actually think it's a really damaging mindset to have. But maybe a word that is helpful in drawing together what you just said is the word productive. So it's not about necessarily having gone through pain, it's more you need to have gone through a process of some sort of achievement. You need to have moved forward some goals or some outcome that you need to reach in order for that day to be worthwhile, and I very much share that feeling.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about your day-to-day. You work in policy around
labour market, employment.
Employment rights, employment
Yeah, so it's a mix. At the moment, I would describe it best as how can the UK be a great place that employers, businesses are hiring people. So that straddles both the employment law side, so about labour rights, but it also straddles the more employee relations stuff about how can businesses ensure that the way that they treat their staff or the way that they have good practice, I suppose, towards their workforce is as good as it can be. Seeing the labour market, as not just numbers and how many people are in work versus how many people are out of work or unemployed, it's also how can the quality of work be good, because if people are in jobs where they feel fulfilled, they feel secure, they feel like they've got ownership, they feel like they are listened to, that they are recognised, ultimately they are more productive, and that has a benefit to the economy.
Okay.
I should say I got to it via having been very, very interested in, and to be honest, remains my ultimate passion and probably something that I will continue in my work after the current job that I'm in, and that is more around the employment rights side. So modern slavery is an issue that it has had quite a lot of interest, certainly around 2015 in the UK when a new act was brought in which tried to tackle modern slavery. I would say it's died down a little bit now. Obviously that's to do with the fact that Brexit is going on and quite a lot of issues to do with the domestic labour market aren't really having very much prominence. But the idea for me that people can be enslaved through their labour is so powerful. To be honest, it's a social issue that motivates me more than poverty, more than homelessness, more than social and economic disadvantage, more than poor education, poor healthcare. Those issues are things that societies need to grapple with, but a fundamental situation that people can find themselves in, which is indebted to somebody else through work, meaning that they have absolutely no freedom, seems to me something that is it's almost so big, it's so central, it's also historically the most, we've had bonded labour, slavery in so many different forms throughout society, that the fact that it still continues in our modern day system, it's not just something that we think about back in the 18th century. Could you give some
examples?
Yeah. So
define it a little bit as well.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so at its heart, it's the idea that an individual does not have personal freedom. That means they don't have personal freedom to travel. They don't have personal freedom quite often to live where they want to live, to eat when they want to eat, because they are bound to another individual who isn't.
So things to talk about were I want to go back over Monday slavery a bit, and then we'll go on to work-life balance. Could you mentioned this thing called modern slavery? Could you briefly define that? You can give some examples and describe how it fits, where you find it. Because I'm not aware of that. I think a lot of people are not aware of that as a thing that exists.
In its simplest terms, it is the idea that people are not in control of their labour. They do not have freedom of choice in where they work, when they work, who they work for, and quite often that is tied to restrictions on their mobility, restrictions on what they are allowed to do, and restrictions on them not being able to look for work elsewhere. So it's the idea that often you are...
it's not just an idea though, it's
a very real thing.
Yeah, it's a word referring to actual practices and organisations that essentially enslave people by binding them to their employer economically, I guess.
Yeah, and or physically, absolutely. So it's certainly not theoretical. It happens a lot. In fact, I think the stat is something shocking like after drugs trafficking, it is the second most prevalent form of trafficking of human persons. So we think about it very commonly in relation to a sex trade, and of course that can be a form of labour. Also with regards to the drugs trade or the arms trade, but actually just the buying and selling of humans to work is also a really, really massive global industry, and it happens in the UK. It happens in UK high streets. You know, there is a lot of emphasis around it in on the high street, nail bars, restaurants, car washes. People hand washing cars in car parks. That's a massive one. Food production, agriculture is huge. Domestic service. Another one that is huge is textile, fashion, particularly big around the Midlands area. There is a lot of family or small scale production of hand woven fabrics or hand embroidered fabrics, which it takes a lot of labour power. It's very, very skillful, and we often think about textile labour abuses in textile factories as being something that happens on the Indian subcontinent. It also happens in the UK.
And how is it able to happen?
Well, it happens because it's very, very profitable. It's very profitable for criminals to get money, but also not just money from the things that they sell, but also money from the fact that they are saving on labour costs. There is no such thing as minimum wage. There is no such thing as all the labour protections that we have in this country. So they are not only getting money from whatever they're producing, it could be fabrics, it could be, selling plates of food, it could be cannabis, whatever it is, they're also saving on that on that side. It happens because consumers aren't aware of it. It happens.
Right.
So there is a lack of understanding around the whole concept. We think of slavery as something that happened in the 18th century. We think of slavery as happening in developing countries. We don't think of it as something that happens on high streets in provincial towns in the UK. There is also the issue around regulation. It's a very difficult thing to regulate insofar as anything that is criminal is difficult to regulate, and also the scale of it versus the resources that the UK government has are woefully imbalanced. So
yeah, I can totally imagine forms of slavery existing on things like heroin plantations, and places where illegal activity is already going on, so everything is necessarily hidden, and therefore they can get away with even further abuses. But what I find hard to imagine is how a restaurant on a UK high street, which is frequented by members of the public, and probably subject to things like sanity and health, sanitation and health,
food inspection and things like that.
And they're getting away with enslaving their employees.
So sometimes it can be linked to migrant groups, sometimes it can be linked to familial groups, and what I mean by that is from the outside it just looks like
someone's working for their parent.
Exactly. So there is often, I think the migrant labour aspect of it should not be underestimated, and the language issue that then causes. And let's face it, lots of people do not know their employment rights. You might be in a 9-to-5 job and not know your employment rights. Somebody who has not grown up in this country, somebody that is in fear, somebody that does not have literacy, can't go on the gov.uk website to find out what their employment rights are. Maybe you're from a country where there is not such a thing as employment rights. All these things are barriers to people coming forward. And also from a consumer point of view, let's face it, we are making amazing strides towards ethical consumerism, but we are still essentially motivated by price. If there is a restaurant on the high street that is cash only and that is cheap, people will go there and they might not be asking uncomfortable questions around how can it afford to be like this.
Right, what were the signs? There were a couple of telltale signs you said. They were kind of pop-up
Yeah, so
organisations and places saying cash only and things like that.
Yeah, and they're not, you know, this like it's not it can't be confirmed that these things are going on in places that are cash only or in places that pop up and disappear and re-emerge on a different place on the high street, but they're just associated telltale signs where something doesn't seem quite right because they don't seem to quite be within the purview of the authorities. They might not be paying tax. If they are a restaurant, they might not be subject to food inspectorates, but they might also not be declaring the fact that they employ a certain number of people and therefore need to be paying a minimum wage. So there are telltale signs in terms of the fact that the business looks impermanent. The business looks like it is not operating within the confines of tax or wage regulation, or it might be a case, for example, where there are signs of people that are sleeping at the workplace, or there might be signs of people, there being a divide between managers that are able to speak with the customers and everybody else. So the idea of front and back room staff, if you like. So that's a telltale sign especially in salons and nail bars, where there'll be individuals that aren't allowed to talk to customers, and that kind of can be put down to language or confidence or things like that, but can also be a method of control.
Okay. So yeah, kind of drawing a line around that. This came up. You said that you found this was a passion of yours, employment rights, and specifically, I guess, the issue of modern-day slavery was a passion of yours that emerged when you started working in policy.
Before that, a master's that was looking at, it was a social and economic history master's, and one of the most interesting things is for me, was not just how much investment in capital, literally technology, in physical infrastructure, how much that has moved on our society, but also how labour conditions have changed, how investment in the labour force in terms of education, employment rights, how that has shaped our modern economy. I found that really interesting. So yeah, I did some work on what it means, what slavery meant back in the end of the 1800s compared to what it means now in a state in India, and did like a longitudinal comparative study.
Okay. I'm tempted to now go off on another tangent and talk about your dissertation. Maybe that is for next time. But I wanted to... We started off talking about the religious roots of the work ethic, and talking about, at some point we talked about how work is understood to usually be a sacrifice, and one of the things that I've been saying recently in interviews with people is that there are apparently 3 ways in which work is kind of sold to you as an idea your whole life. The way I felt it was to me. One was either you just have to work so you can get paid and earn money so you can buy food, as a purely an exchange of capital. One as a form of a form of passion, through which you discovered yourself and built yourself and became a member of the community, and that transitions then into 3. Fulfillment of a social responsibility, or responsibility towards the group, the community that you live in, to help somehow, to help that community meet its needs, so that you're not getting a free ride on the basis of someone else's work. So those were kind of three models that I'm currently thinking about. try and transitioning into what it's something to do with work-life balance.
Well, no, I mean, if I can give a response to that in terms of, I think that that's right. I think that I would add a fourth because it's quite a pastoral way of thinking about work.
Right.
Meaning, when we had communities that, you know, in a very, pastoral is maybe the best word. You know, you've got the baker, you've got the doctor, you've got the banker. That kind of makes sense. I think the massive change that we've got now is, I do think to a certain degree there are just jobs for the sake of upholding the massive complexity of how things are now produced, which has created a whole industry, if you like, of people to work in and of themselves. Let me explain that in a better way. So the way that you've just described those three aspects of work is almost very one-dimensional. You know, it's either somebody working to get their money, to go and buy food, to eat their food. That's a very almost simple transaction from A to B. Even if you were working in the group scenario, you know, you become a builder, you become a thatcher, you become a midwife to support the group dynamic. That is also still almost like a very small chain between you, your labour, and the benefit that you see from it. Also, if you find a vocation like teaching, like nursing, like, you know, dentistry, whatever, there is also quite a small chain between you giving your labour and then the individual that's receiving it and hopefully benefiting from it. And today, in this situation where we have a capitalist situation which is very complex, there is so much interdependency of supply chains, and that has caused amazing things. I mean, let's not talk about this just in a negative way. I'm not portraying that negatively at all, insofar as we have now, because of that system, we are producing far more. In general, people's living standards have increased. We have created a very prosperous society because of this interconnection. But it does mean that somebody who might be working in business A in London has absolutely no idea, or has very little feedback on the work that they're actually doing, because they are, I don't know, a telecoms agency who is being contracted by a company in France, and that company in France is a construction firm that is supporting the building of infrastructure projects in China. You know, it's a much more complicated situation where you might not be able to directly see the impact of your work in quite the same way as you described it. So the fourth way I think about work is just to uphold the current interconnected capitalist system that we've got.
Right. That leads me into my things I said before about my fear of the workplace. There are a number of dimensions. Like, I found it quite hard to find a job and stay in that job. You know, I've had jobs here and there in the service industry, but that's it. One of the reasons is that I don't understand that fourth dimension that you just added to the model. Has made it difficult for me to be able to assess the degree to the value of a given job here or there. So I've because of something about the way that I think, I've been reluctant to go to a job because it might not fulfill one of the key criteria, because I can't tell, because that fourth criteria obscures some of the first three. And then there's this other aspect of being afraid of not being able to perform in the workplace and letting someone down, and just all these elements that, you know, I feel that, I'm just going to speak, I'm riffing for a little bit, but I feel that people sometimes look at a situation like mine and think, you know, why don't you want to go out and work? I wanted to. That's what I hear from my parents and from my parents. I've always heard, either they defined themselves through work, or they discovered themselves at work, or at least that they were desperate to get out to work when they were kids, because that was where real life was. And you said something before about learning to cope with the day-to-day being a rite of passage into adulthood. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay,
talking.
so first thing, which is around how do you assess the value of your work. This is a really common thing now, which I think people are grappling with. An anthropologist called David Graeber, who I'm not totally sold on his thesis, but I think it is a compelling one nonetheless, has this idea that the fact that you can't see the direct results of your labour, and therefore, in his terminology, sometimes think your job is bullshit. It has no benefit to you.
Theory,
it has no benefit to you, but you also don't know what benefit it is supposed to be having, and you don't know whether it is having that benefit or not. That idea of your job being bullshit, he thinks, or he puts down to causing a lot of social anxiety. So it's not, I don't think it's a harebrained and totally unique experience to have. And I think it is something that we increasingly need to be able to reconcile, or businesses need to find ways of ensuring that there is always meaning and purpose in people's work as we move more into a service economy and away from the idea of people having vocations. We can't all be lucky enough to have a passion in what we do. We can't all be lucky enough to have a vocation and stick to it. So there is a massive cohort of people who are needing to work because they need to pay their rent, need to pay their mortgage, need to buy food, need to clothe their kids. But there is also a contingent of people where it's not hand to mouth that people are working. I don't need to work day to day, or I don't need to work that day to pay for my dinner that night. And so we need to understand, yes, we're doing it for a certain amount of stability and a certain amount of quality of living, but there is also something else, which is we need to be able to reconcile why we are doing it. And as much as businesses can, or I think employers can explain how, for example, their service sector job supports the industry or has meaning for another company in another place, another group of people in another place, I think it'll be really, really beneficial. And I suppose I don't have the answer. I'm just highlighting it as a problem that I can also perceive in the labour market, and I'm not surprised that it is a personal experience, because I think it's one that lots of people share.
So,
well, I was going to go on to sort of the second area, which was all about fear of the workplace and routine, but also about the performative aspect of it.
Yeah,
but if you want to come in with a question.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, so what's your experience been in transitioning from being a student to being a working person, and what kind of pressures are you under, and what's your understanding of that process? Because I haven't gone through it, and I know to some extent I've avoided going through it, and I've looked for a pathway that avoids going through that. And
so I think that's been the most defining aspect of my early 20s. And as I move into my late 20s, having gone through that transition and trying to improve the situation so that I have work-life balance, so that I am not solely defined by my work, is, I think, what I'm currently experiencing. So certainly at school, since being 16 and going to sixth form college, and then at university, certainly doing subjects where you had relatively little contact time as a humanities student, your time was your own. And in the workplace, your time isn't your own. And that is a massive shift to go through.